Several years ago when I was on vacation, I got a call at 7:30 on a Sunday morning from some people I knew saying, our pastor is really sick today. We know that you're in the area. Would you like to come and fill in for us, our pastor today? Okay, I can do that. I told him, I said, I'm going to come in my jeans and my tennis shoes because I'm on vacation and I don't have any dress clothes, appropriate church clothes. And they said, we'll take care of that. I got there. They wanted me to put on some slacks and a shirt that they got, which all were too large for me, which I thought was awkward. And then they said, oh, and by the way, there is a boy that needs to be baptized today. And I said, what? He said, well, all of his family has come to visit and he's getting baptized today. And I said, well, why doesn't his Sunday school teacher baptize him? He's in his class. He knows him. And all the men were like, oh, no, we need to have a pastor baptize him. And I was like, no, you don't. He can baptize him. You don't need to have a pastor baptize. Pastor Tim Holscher, and we're looking at the ministry of the Spirit, and we sometimes are surprised what church actually looks like, and we might be surprised by what a church can do without a pastor. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16 and verse 12, we notice it says, but concerning Apollos. Now, Apollos was one of these men Paul had, some people that Paul had met, Priscilla and Aquila. They met Apollos. Apollos was a believer, but he didn't know a lot of things that he should have known. And so they ended up teaching him more. And Apollos became very strong in the word as a result. And Apollos had eventually landed in Corinth after Paul was there, and seemed that he had been largely taking the reins of the pastorate, but he's left. And if you read through Corinthians, some of you might go, well, there's no wonder he left. I wouldn't have wanted to have to deal with that mess either. But he says, I encouraged him greatly to come to you with the brethren, and it was not at all his desire. He didn't really want to come, but he will come when he has a good time, an opportunity when there's a good time. Apollos is not with the Corinthian church, which means this church is functioning at this time with all of these various people together, but they don't really have a leader. We'd look at the letter and we'd say, well, they have some people that are trying to lead, but none of them are really doing so appropriately. Their leadership is more like, I want to do it. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I want to be in charge, rather than what is beneficial for everyone. And in the middle of 1 Corinthians chapter 14 and verse 26, we get a little glimpse of some of what life would be like in a church where there was no pastor, but it also shows us some things that really can go on in a church service. And again, it's not all about a few songs at the beginning, an announcement, a prayer, and a message. It's really about all of the people coming together and all of them being prepared to serve in some way. Maybe they serve quietly with somebody that they talk with in the back of the church. Maybe they serve in a more open, more vocal manner during the church service. And so in 1 Corinthians 14:26, it says, what then, brothers and sisters, whenever you come together, each one has a hymn. Think about today. We go to church and we have somebody else that picks out the hymns. Now at our church, even on Sunday mornings once in a while, we have favorite day. And we may say, we're going to take four favorite songs today. So get yours in early, and we give them time to actually think of a song while we do a couple of other things, and then we let people choose songs they want to sing. That doesn't fit very well with our model where we want that service structured, and we want to make sure all the songs fit the message that the pastor is going to speak or things along this line. But when they did it, hey, people came and they had a hymn. People came and they had a teaching. They'd been thinking about God's truth during that week, and they've come together and they've got something they want to share. They got some teaching that they want to share with people. They have a revelation. I've got a revelation this week. Now, the revelation doesn't happen with us anymore, really, because God has given us all the revelation that we need in His Word. So this is where we find that revelation, is here in His Word. But back then, at that time, they were still getting revelation downloaded, because when Paul writes 1 Corinthians, he's only written 2 letters before this, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. And there's a very good chance that the Corinthians didn't even have a copy of one of these letters, because this is so close to the time that he's written this letter. And so he says a revelation, and then the tongue, because there were people, remember, that were given this special ability to be able to speak in another language, help them to communicate who God was to people that didn't speak their languages. But there's also an interpretation. I can interpret these things. Now, is that all that's going on? Well, those are the ones that Paul has heard about. He says, and everything is to be done for building up. In other words, when you do all of this, the whole purpose should be to edify other people. So, he says, if anyone speaks in a tongue, there are to be only 2 or at most 3. Now, what he's doing is he says you could turn the service into something that it's just endless. It's just people all the time wanting to speak in these other languages. And then you have to have somebody interpret this. And he says, keep it to 2 or 3. That's enough. There's other things to go on in the church service. If there's no interpreter, then that person is to sit by. He goes again in verse 29, 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and then let the others evaluate. Notice the others. Well, it could be other prophets, but it could be people with the discerning of spirits as a gift, but it could be all the other believers to look at it and go, that doesn't line up with what we've been taught. That person was telling us that this was okay, and that's not okay. We have over in the book of Revelation, in one of the churches over there, I have a woman that calls herself a prophetess, and she tells the believers it's okay to eat things offered to idols and to participate in their sacrifices. And we'd say, well, doesn't Paul say that? Well, actually, Paul says you can, because it's not bad, but don't do it if you knowingly are participating, because you don't want others to say, hey, look at you, you're sharing in my God. And so you tested. Other people could know this stuff, and they could test by what they were taught. And even though they don't have a Bible to open at this point, they know these things that they're being taught as Christians. And the rest of them are sitting around and evaluate. But so in verse 31, he says, for you can all prophesy one by one. But obviously they're not all going to prophesy, because he said 2 or 3 in that. All of this simply to say is that I think if we were to go back and visit a first century church service, it probably would look very different than the way we do church today. And if we tried to go back and do this model, yeah, it would be a little uncomfortable for us. But I think eventually people would learn to function the way God intended it to be. And this does not preclude the idea that you're going to have people that are actually taking time to study. And if you have leaders, if you actually have a pastor-teacher, which Apollos is absent, then you're going to have people that are studying. They're going to get up and they're going to teach at length. And again, we do a church service where everybody's in the door. We have a church service and we're out in an hour. And when they met for church services, when they met like this went on sometimes for 2 or 3 hours. And there was probably in 2 or 3 hours, you probably had 2 or 3 different people that actually took time to teach at length in the midst of all of this. In addition to the fact that there were then some hymns that were sung and things like this. All of this simply, again, reminding us, church is very different than the way we model it today. And I think sometimes the way we structure it so carefully today, the way we do that so carefully, that it actually it quenches the spirit a little bit. It keeps us from actually being able to allow people to really serve and minister in ways that God would like them to. And we maybe need to back off a little bit. And this is tough for me. I like a structured service. It's easy for me to deal with. But I realize sometimes that that doesn't always work. That sometimes we actually need to stop and say, God wants to do something maybe in my life or one of these other people's lives through somebody out here today that has something to share. And it's not something that they can share in 3 minutes. It might take them 10 minutes to share this. And we need to allow them that opportunity if that's the case. Again, all of this is different than the world tells us that we ought to do this. So we're looking at this is how the church actually functioned according to Scripture. Not how some book that we might have on a shelf back here, how that person figured out the best way to do church. We're looking and saying, hey, this is the way God says. It can function this way, and it can work. Even if there's not a pastor present, these things can still be carried on. And I trust that encourages you to think about how you do church, how you participate in church. And with that, I encourage you to have a good day in the Lord. Thank you for joining me today.